Welcome to the show today. I am Seth Gruber, host of the Unaborted podcast, which you know if you listen to this, but this is a very unique and fascinating episode and conversation that is going to be used to reach and mobilize and educate people far beyond just the reach of my humble personal little podcast. We are sitting down today with two incredible people, one of whom you have heard on this show before, Audrey Werner of the Matthew 18 group that does wonderful work explaining the occult, humanist, progressive roots of what brought us our pornographic culture, the sexual chaos that has ensued from the sexual revolution, and the radical dogmatic commitment of revolutionaries to comprehensive sexuality education, or CSE, which is basically just a way to sexualize children and expose them to any and all forms of sexual activity at the earliest of ages. Because if you can get the kids while they're young, they'll serve you forever. And we've had Audrey on the show before, but one of her mentors and one of the people that was actually the first ones in a very real way to connect so many of the humanist, Darwinist, evolutionist, neo-Malthusian ethics of what brought us the sexual revolution in the first place is our second guest today, Claire Chambers, who wrote a book published in 1977 called The SIECUS Circle, a Humanist Revolution. Listen, you sometimes, listener, have asked yourself the question, how did we get here? Why are men who want to wear tights and lingerie that show their privates, why do they want to read books to my kids so badly at the library? Some of you are asking the question, why is Attorney General Merrick Garland arresting pro-life sidewalk counselors? Why did Karine Jean-Pierre, Biden's White House press secretary, in the fall of 2022, refer to pro-life conservative Christians as ultra-MAGA Republicans and quote, the greatest and most extreme threat to freedom and democracy? Some of you have asked, why if I met in my church at 50% capacity in the summer of 2020 to worship the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, I was called a super spreader and a granny killer who hated my neighbor. But when BLM and Antifa burned down Democrat-run cities, it was called mostly peaceful and nobody was concerned with the outbreak of COVID. My point is this. Some of you are wondering, how in the world did we get here? What in the heck happened to the American culture that I knew in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s? The 2000s, the 2010s. The answer is this. Things happen gradually, then suddenly. Just like bankruptcy. Some of you who have gone bankrupt or have friends who have gone bankrupt, that didn't happen all of a sudden. It's like, oh, I'm bankrupt. No, there were probably a series of decisions that were made over a long period of time that led to said bankruptcy. I'm here today to suggest the same thing is true politically, the same thing is true culturally, and the same thing is true of ideologies. You see, ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have victims. Policies have consequences because politics has consequences. So G.K. Chesterton once said, happy is he who knows not only the hidden causes of things, but who has not lost touch with their beginnings. In other words, happy is he who knows how we got here. Happy is he who can trace the thread of ideas back to foundations that birthed certain ideologies and movements. And one of the first people to do this in the immediate years following the chaos of the sexual revolution was Claire Chambers, who's sitting with us today, the author of The SIECUS Circle, A Humanist Revolution. You've heard me talk about SIECUS. It's the Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States. Before we welcome and introduce our guests, Claire Chamber and Audrey Werner today, I thought it would be valuable to frame the timbers, if you will, to explain that when certain institutions and organizations seem like they're all on the same team, it's probably because they were always on the same team. That probably wasn't coincidental. And so before we welcome our wonderful guest who has been blazing trails for other culture warriors who did not even know that they were walking in the wake of Claire Chambers. Let me cite Abraham Lincoln, who understood that ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. This is going to set the tone for our long-form conversation and podcast today to help explain to you how we got to this position in the American culture war and maybe how we can get out. Abraham Lincoln, the anti-slavery president, the president who freed the slaves, famously said, when we see a lot of framed timbers, different positions of which we know have been gotten out at different times and places and by different workmen. Let's call them Stephen, Franklin, Roger, and James, for instance. And when we see these timbers joined together and we see that they exactly make the frame of a house or a mill, all the tenons and mortises exactly fitting, and all the lengths and proportions of different pieces exactly adapted to their respective places, and not a piece too many or too few. In such a case, we find it impossible not to believe that Stephen and Franklin and Roger and James all understood one another from the beginning and all worked upon a common plan or draft drawn up before the first lick was struck. We have called this the long walk through the institutions, and Antonio Gramsci, one of the modern fathers of Marxism, called this the strategy of the robes. If you can get the robes of academia, the robes of the courts, the robes of the clergy, then onward with the revolution. If you can walk through these institutions and control the significant aspects of these culturally formative institutions, you can upend all of society. Claire Chambers knew that from the early 70s, within years of Roe v. Wade getting passed. She joins us today on the show, Unaborted with Seth Gruber. Claire, welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much, Seth. It's just such a pleasure to be with you. It really is.
Well, it's a privilege to be sitting next to you. I have been poring over this book, and the what you knew in the 70s is just fascinating, and this is so much a predictor of where we're at today. And when you understand that bad seed yields a bitter harvest, to quote the Holy Scriptures,
Absolutely.
Then we understand how we got here. And you were more detailing those bad seeds than anyone else I'm aware of in the 70s. And here we are in 2023, and we're eating and we're going, this is a bitter, bitter harvest. And yet you were kind of trying to wake up the church and good people even back then. Audrey, thank you for being with us today. Audrey Werner, of course, been on the podcast 2 or 3 different times, and the founder and president of the MomWho 18 group. Very briefly, Audrey, tell us what MomWho 18 exists to do, and why you're here today with us.
MomWho 18 group is based on Matthew 18:15-17. So my experience being a nurse, former sex educator, then working in the STD clinic, seeing the fruits of my labor, and like you said, bad fruit, and realizing I was lied to, that they told me I would have good fruit. I ended up with bad fruit. I watched society get more sexualized, children more sexually active. So I started to do research, and one of the people I came across was Claire, and her book was very valuable for me. We've talked about other mentors the Lord has given me, incredible people, all people that have a knowledge and fear of the Lord.
Yeah.
And so I have been very blessed. So my focus in the beginning was to wake up the church. I thought, wow, if we've morally shifted, and it was based on this fraudulent criminal things from Nazi-Kinsey, then certainly we need to purge that from the church, and we need to move back to God's word and God's word alone. And so that's why I started up the MomWho 18 group. And I, like Claire, started by just speaking to small groups of parents.
Wonderful.
And she kind of didn't have as much open doors back then. And certainly, if you mentioned communism back then, I think you were considered a conspiracy theorist.
Exactly. And so
And-
are.
Yeah.
And today we have legislators that are openly communist. So it's no longer conspiracy theory.
Yeah,
this is facts. This is, as you well said, this is why we are where we are today.
Yeah.
So
Claire, as we move over to you now, and we're going to have notes and books here because the purpose of this long form discussion and interview today is to channel our inner honest Abe
Yes.
and frame the timbers.
Yes.
There are a lot of timbers that need to be identified for us to start recognizing how deeply these early revolutionaries, well, I guess really the early revolutionaries go back to Darwin and Thomas Malthus, but some of the disciples in the 20th century of those early revolutionaries were cooperating and communicating at a level that I don't think most American Christians understand. They were all on the same team. They may have had different battlefronts, but all their colonels were communicating on walkie-talkies, if you will.
Yes.
They all understood one another from the beginning before the first lick or draft was drawn up.
Exactly.
And they worked upon that common blueprint. What originally happened in your heart and in your life, Claire, in the 70s that caused you to go, oh my goodness, someone needs to start explaining and identifying this humanist revolution, its goals, its creeds, and its high priests, and their goal of upending society. What was happening in you? What led you to do the amount of research you did? As what I said in the introduction to people, I think the first major attempt, author and book, to connect all the pieces at such an early stage.
Well, first of all, maybe what we haven't mentioned yet is that I did have a co-author. Together we make Claire Chambers. So she, I think she was a little ahead of me. I got to know her through her husband's job. I happened to work for the same company. And we became very good friends. And she really was the one that said, things aren't so good.
Yeah.
So we became friends, and I sort of drew on a circle of conservatives, people from different organizations eventually. But when it came to sex education, she said, how do you feel about that? I said, what's wrong with that? That's true.
Well,
I said, there's nothing wrong with sex education. Well, let's look and find out. And so we were invited to be on a sex committee. Anyone who wanted to apply, that is, a sex education committee.
okay.
And that really started the whole thing.
Wow.
And I'm deeply indebted to her.
So basically, you started going down the rabbit hole
Yes,
and
exactly.
saying, "Oh my gosh!" Let's say it this way: you got red pilled.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So let's start framing the timbers. As Audrey and I were discussing this conversation and recording beforehand, one of the things we discussed was just how much information there is, how many organizations and sources there are to weed through. In fact, the 2/3 of your book is called The Circle of Organizations, that's explaining all of the humanist organizations and their relationship to one another and their relationship to SIECUS. This was a true revolution. And so we have our notes and we have our books here because to frame the timbers actually takes a bit of time. This
Yes,
is not
it does.
easy to do, even for education research analysts such as yourself, and for voracious researchers and readers like Audrey. This is still quite a project. And so here's the first question I wanted to ask you, Claire. Can you talk about the precursors to what became SIECUS? What was the philosophical, dare I say, religious precepts, individuals, and movements that were already happening, moving, and at work, shaping and shifting in the American culture war
Yes.
prior to the founding of SIECUS, What were the kind of ideologies and the revolutionaries that were imbibing those ideologies and dogmatically inserting those ideas into the law, into the culture wars? In other words, help us frame the timbers that would start to build something like the Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States.
Well, this is, as you say, it's really very involved. It's very intricate. And as I told you earlier, it's like discussing this is like trying to squeeze an elephant into a conch shell.
Yeah.
It's just impossible. And you don't always like the sounds that come out of it.
Yeah, very true. Well put.
So I wasn't sure if you wanted to go into early education first, or do you want to stick with just prior to SIECUS?
So the SIECUS is founded by Mary Calderon, the medical director of Planned Parenthood, who leaves Planned Parenthood in 1964 to found SIECUS. And for our listeners who are not aware, SIECUS is the first organization from which others would later be birthed, that was so radically committed to this pornographic sex ed, to just exposing children to the most vile things at the youngest of ages. And so all the mama bears and papa bears that started speaking at school board meetings in the last 2 years, that's being pushed by SIECUS and other similar organizations that are writing this comprehensive sex ed today. So why don't you start with education and maybe some of the ideologies, some of the revolutionaries, and you in your book, Claire, you actually explain how the UN, the United Nations, and the United Nations Ethical Society Cultural Organization, which I believe is described as UNESCO, UNESCO, the United Nations Ethical Society Cultural Organization. You make the point in your book that actually the beginnings of what would become SIECUS were already working through the United Nations. So wherever you'd like to go, help our listeners understand what was going on that would lead to the founding of such a wicked organization whose founders and board members and directors were all functioning off of Marxist principles, humanist principles, evolutionary principles, and ultimately, I think what we have to understand, Claire, as a proxy war attack against Christianity.
Absolutely. I think it's important to sort of understand that during our revolution, the American Revolution, it was the pastors, the churches, where the revolutionaries met, and and from the very beginning, we have always had that. We're actually a Judeo-Christian nation, and have been defined so by the U.S. Supreme Court. But let's try maybe in the early 1900s, where Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger was very busy on a long crusade with the extremists of her day. And it's been described in the humanist, I'm sorry, not in the SIECUS circle.
Yes.
I described that, quote, it was the radicals, political, economic, and religious, among whom Margaret Sanger found her first supporters.
That's right.
And she herself was one of them. Her father, Matthew Higgins, was a socialist and the so-called village atheist of Corning, New York. And explaining the religious persuasion of Margaret Sanger herself, I quote, the word humanism in its present religio-scientific meaning was not then current, but call it free thought or rationalism or secularism, it remained Margaret Sanger's creed. The first paper that she founded and edited was called The Woman Rebel, and its masthead bore the motto, No gods, no masters. So we're off to a good start with that. Author George Grant has explained
He's a friend of mine, by the way. And
Is he really?
I had him on the podcast last fall, and
Oh,
he's a worldwide expert on the life of Sanger.
he wrote a
So-
marvelous book called Grand Delusions,
That's right.
as I recall.
So go ahead.
So in Grand Delusions, George Grant says, Planned Parenthood-style sex education is shocking. It seems to be designed to break down sexual inhibitions, invalidate sexual taboos, and undermine sexual values. It is almost as if it purposely betrays parental and community trust, inciting youngsters to an emotional and sensual frenzy. Planned Parenthood sex education programs and materials are brazenly perverse. They are frequently accentuated with crudely obscene four-letter words and illustrated by explicitly obscene nudity. They openly endorse aberrant behavior, homosexuality, masturbation, fornication, incest, and even bestiality, sex with animals.
Yeah.
And then they describe that behavior in excruciating details. Now, a leading luminary of Planned Parenthood, it so happens, was Dr. Mary Calderon. In fact, she was with Planned Parenthood as I believe an executive director, and she was a physician, of course, and she served with them for 11 years, immediately to founding SIECUS.
That's right. Yeah.
So she was ready. She was ready.
Now, Claire, one of the interesting aspects and observations that you make in your book was how tied in the United Nations was with so much of the rot that was spawned out of the sexual revolution and the chaos that ensued. But you actually talk about a United Nations ethical societal cultural organization sponsored event in 1964 called the International Symposium on Health Education, Sex Education, and Education for Home and Family Living. It's a heck of a title. And you make the observation that Mary Calderon was at this international symposium. I believe it was in Sweden. And that this became the blueprint for the founding of SIECUS, of which Mary Calderon would found just months following that UN-sponsored symposium on all of the kind of sex ed that became the focus of SIECUS. Can you kind of trace some of the roots for us and what was going on there?
I'd love to trace a few of the roots before we get there, because this is important. Because Frank Calderon, who was Mary's husband,
Okay.
and he was a physician also, he was at the United Nations World Health Organization as early as 1945.
Whoa.
And he with
20 years before
20
SIECUS was
years
founded.
before. He was busy
Okay.
laying the groundwork, totally laying the groundwork. He did it with Brock Chisholm, who was a Humanist of the Year for 1962. He worked with him. Together they shaped WHO's policies and structure. This was Frank Calderon.
And I believe G. Brock Chisholm, who you just referenced, that Mary Calderon's husband worked for, was the director of the World Health
He
Organization.
was the director,
Wow.
and he was also the Humanist of the Year for 1959.
Wow.
So they, and meanwhile, at the same time this was happening, maybe a few years later, a few years later, when Mary Calderon had actually founded SIECUS, 3 years later, Frank Calderon, it so happened, owned the Minsky Burlesque out on Long Island in New York.
Wow.
And in 1967, 3 years later, since she founded it, and in 68, he imported the Minsky Burlesque from Las Vegas. And he had slated that same show for the next year in 1969. And certain parts of this were described by Nassau County District Attorney William Kahn as very lewd and obscene. And it was stopped from going on as staged. Now, while all this was happening, Mary Calderon flaunted her concern for young people that too much sex-saturated society exists. And she was so concerned that she founded SIECUS while he did this.
Wow.
So,
Wow,
or
that's
I'm sorry,
interesting.
she founded SIECUS 3 years before, but
That's right.
I'm sure she was very
Well,
concerned.
I think the takeaway there, what the point that needs to be made there, right, is that these were not just ideas. This is called humanism praxis, right? That they were practicing this stuff. They were living these things.
Mm-hmm.
So much so that the founder of SIECUS, her husband, is putting on sexually titillating performances in the public square.
Yeah.
No surprise that she's putting the seeds of those type of behavior and ideas in the minds of young people through her organization. So, wow, that's
And of course, the humanists have always created the disease and then supplied the antidote. So that's
well, that makes me think of a lot of things over the last 3 years, but we won't go there right now.
okay. Now, getting back to her husband, while he was working with WHO, he was their whole chief administrator. He wasn't just an employee.
Wow.
And and by the way, keep that in mind now, that's the World Health Organization. When I served on a sex education committee, the very first night, the opening night, in came our superintendent of schools. And he made the announcement, the first words that came out of his mouth after greeting us was, I really want you to have all you need to put this together and create a wonderful sex education program. And what I would like you to do is cooperate with the UN's World Health Organization in developing your program. And this is recommended by our state Board of Education to do that.
Yeah.
Okay,
So now we're starting to see the ties that already existed between the UN that's long been obsessed with this idea that there's too many people on planet Earth.
Yes.
We got to do something about that. The sun god's really angry.
Absolutely.
Mother Gaia is angry and we're harming
Yes.
Mother Gaia. And so the UN has long been obsessed with this idea that they have a moral and political, dare I say, a spiritual obligation to become master planners, to become masters of the universe,
absolutely.
to significantly reduce the world population. And later we'll actually talk about how sex ed is actually kind of the prerequisite in many ways. And we'll talk about that later to this population limitation or reduction plan. But it's just interesting for everyone listening. I want you to catch the significance of what Claire just said. The husband of the founder of SIECUS is a high official of the World Health Organization, sponsored by the UN, working for World Health Organization Director G. Brock Chisholm, who's long been obsessed with this idea of there's too many people on planet Earth. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, you actually trace in your book some of the early seeds of the, let's call it the early attempts at sex ed in the public schools. And I wanted to quote you here. This was a fascinating aspect and contribution you made here. G. Brock Chisholm, who we're just talking about, the head of WHO at the time.
And the humanist of the year 1959.
That's right. So obviously we know what kind of creeds and ideas he's operating off of. Was working with, and you make this point, was working with Julian Huxley to lay the foundation for what would turn into comprehensive sexuality education, or SIECUS-sponsored sex ed. And he was invited to give 3 lectures in D.C. by special invitation by his friend Alger Hiss, and began advocating for sex ed starting as early as 4th grade. And here is where this starts taking a darker and more sinister turn, and where it starts revealing, oh, you had some far more ulterior and sinister motives behind your science-driven education. And here's what you say. You actually quote Chisholm in some of his 3 lectures delivered in DC I believe this was in 48.
That sounds about right.
And he talks about the importance of eliminating, quote, the way of the elders.
Yes.
The way of the elders. Isn't that interesting? And the necessity upon insisting on, quote, the eradication of the concept of right and wrong. The eradication of the concept of right and wrong, Claire, is what G. Brock Chisholm said in his sponsored, invited by Alger Hiss, 1948 DC lectures, 48, 58, 60, 16 years before SIECUS is founded.
Yes.
So there's a concept in your book called situation ethics. Yes. The architect and father of whom is named Joseph Fletcher. I think we might need to talk about that because there are deeper worldview premises at work here that we need to understand. Why in the world would the director of the World Health Organization say, in talking about sex ed, that it's important to eradicate the concept of right and wrong? Yes. Can you guys start explaining what are some of the worldview premises at work that would lead to such ludicrous statements and praxis?
Well, and we were talking about this earlier, but the setup of, law means fixed. And as you said, America is a Christian nation, but we're not a Christian nation because we have more churches or more Christians. We're Christian nations because our laws and our government were founded on the principles of the Old and New Testament. And by the way, I love the course Biblical Citizenship, which is teaching Christians and churches now about our foundations.
Rick Green's a good friend.
Yes,
he's doing great work.
Yes, he's doing a great job. And David Barden. And but it was so God's law. It was based on God's law, which was the common law, and that was fixed. And I think for those on the other side, they were frustrated because God's law never changes. A law means fixed in every language.
Right.
So you have the Darwin concept brought into the universities in the late 1800s, especially in the law schools. And so now you're teaching that where man is evolving. Well, if man's evolving, then law needs to evolve. And so a situational ethics, which might be right for you morally, might not be right for someone else. So we need to move away from God's law. So that's where the shift came. And they needed the science and the social science. And that's why the legal system starts to change. And you start to see the call for getting rid of the common law and drafting some kind of new law, which becomes the Model Penal Code.
Right.
In the sex offense section, and they need the social science behind it. So the wealthy elite are funding the American Law Institute is founded in 1923, which is the educational arm of the American Bar Association, and then UNESCO at the UN is the educational arm of the UN. And so you have to go out and educate people, leaders, in this new idea of shifting law and getting rid of, in the legal system, we have to get rid of the common law and we have to bring in a model penal code. And they needed the social science behind it. And that's where Alfred Kinsey, his science was used. So he was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the National Institute for Health.
Right.
And yes, and Hugh Hefner later funded SIECUS, but worked. He was a disciple of Hugh Hefner's.
Yeah.
So
and we're going to dive into exactly what was the bunk science behind all of that led to the founding of the Institute for Sex Research, later renamed the Kinsey Institute. But the point I wanted to make, and that I wanted you guys to help build out for our listeners, is that these people were simply using sex ed as a tool to be wielded for far more sinister political revolutionary goals.
It's changing a nation.
And so, Claire, you quote Thomas Altizer, the contemporary leader of the Death of God movement, who was not a name I was familiar with, and I was doing some research on him. he was a pretty significant author, individual, and revolutionary, founder of the Death of God movement. And you quote him at the end of your chapter 2 here.
Could you spell his last name?
Altizer. Althusser.
Oh,
Thomas
yes, okay,
Althusser.
thank you.
And here's how he put it, just so we're framing the timbers to understand that this was a relativistic, no gods and no masters, to quote
Yes.
Margaret Sanger,
Yes.
revolution. And he said, once God has ceased to exist in human experience as the omnipotent and numinous Lord, there perishes with him every moral imperative addressed to man from a beyond, and humanity ceases to be imprisoned by an obedience to an external will or authority. And you hear a lot of these revolutionaries say things like this. This comes out a lot in Lester Kirkendall's writing, who you're going to touch on in a little bit.
Yes.
This comes out in some of the writings from, many of the board members of SIECUS, was their disdain for the Christian ethic. And to piggyback off of what Audrey was saying, right? They use science, loosely defined,
Yes.
to add a layer of intellectual credibility
Yes.
to what they're doing.
Yes.
But they seem to only cite their other revolutionary friends
Yes.
and never
And
cite
yes.
or observe the science from
Yes.
people on the other side of the aisle.
Exactly.
Which is interesting.
And they love to flaunt all of their titles to each other
Yes.
to make sure everyone understands.
Yeah.
We want to get to that UNESCO-sponsored symposium, but I wonder if first we didn't really adequately explain situation ethics, and I think Audrey can explain that a little more.
Well,
Right.
like I said earlier about what is morally right for you may not be morally right. And I was thinking about when we were talking about the UN, they also push for the sexual rights of the child, that the child should be able to decide. And you're starting to see in the sex ed circles, in the committees, the word consent is now in sex education committees.
Yeah.
Now we're going to teach children how do you consent, and not telling them anything's morally right or wrong. You can consent when you're a young child, or you can consent when you're married, but or you're on a date or whatever.
Yeah.
It's situational
Well,
ethics.
if I could paraphrase Joseph Fletcher's situational
Yes.
ethics for the layperson,
yes,
if it feels good, do it.
exactly.
Absolutely.
That seems to be the
Absolutely.
premise of situation ethics.
Exactly.
Is that an act is not right or wrong in the nature of the act itself.
Right.
An act is only right or wrong to the degree that it brings pleasure and joy
Yes.
or pain and destruction. So if
Yeah.
you enjoy it,
Yeah.
then it actually cannot be morally wrong.
Exactly.
And so that's why consent becomes one of the linchpins
Exactly.
of the sexual revolution. They only gauge a moral act and an immoral act based off of whether consent was obtained or not.
Exactly.
And so this is actually very important for everyone listening. You need to start understanding now why there's always been this push
Yeah.
to argue
Mhm.
that children have the mental advancement and development to
Mhm.
consent.
Consent.
Because
Exactly.
then, if they consent to an adult-child relationship, if they consent to have their genitals chopped off because the boy thinks he's a girl,
Right. Then it's not
and
morally
the parent
wrong.
doesn't want them to,
Yes.
then the child should be removed from the home. There are Democrats in America pushing similar legislation. There's a bill right now in California that's pushing this rights of the child stuff. So I know you wanted to get to some of the push from these demonic revolutionaries who thought that children had sexual rights. But maybe before we dive into that, can you start going back to these early gatherings of UN would-be revolutionaries, such as this symposium sponsored by UNESCO that led to the founding of SIECUS?
Yes, it
What did you
very-
want to contribute there?
It very, very definitely did. Okay, I think if I may.
And I believe in your book, if
Here
I
I am.
recall, this happened in Sweden.
In Sweden,
And
Yes.
there were political leaders from various
Do you know,
countries there.
I have to correct myself. It was not in Sweden. There were Swedish delegates that we'll talk about.
Okay.
But this took place in Hamburg, Germany.
Okay, thank you.
Favorite place of
Yes, a lot happens in Germany.
of the you know who's. Well, it was in Hamburg, Germany, and at this symposium they discussed health ed, sex ed, and family living. Not surprisingly, remember it was UNESCO sponsored, and the delegates that were there received training in discussion techniques, role playing, psychosocial drama, all of the things that humanists love. And there was a proposal that was adopted there, considered to be universal sex education. And it was introduced by 2 Swedish delegates. And included in their subject outline was the structure and function of the genitals. Now, this sounds very innocent in a way, but when you see pictures of what the children are shown in school, they flaunt all of this in large sizes, all kinds of things. And then masturbation was included there, abortion, of course, birth control, and, not to be excluded, sexual deviations.
Yeah.
So 5 months later, after the symposium, was when SIECUS began to function.
Wow.
They
And
even
Mary Calderon was there.
Yes. Oh, I'm sure she was there. I don't have, how could she not have been there?
Yeah.
You know. So, and keep in mind too that Frank, her husband Frank, had all of these connections,
Right.
not only with WHO, where he was the chief administrator, but it was UNESCO and what was the other organization that fails me at the moment. But he had this interlocking business going on,
Right.
even with Alger Hiss. I'm going to mention him later.
Okay.
So,
And you make the point in your book, Claire, actually, that the Swedish blueprint
yes.
for sex ed is an almost like for like
Yes.
to the first proposals and
Yes.
initiatives of the Sexuality Information
Yes,
Education
and that
Council of
was
the United
adopted.
States. That's right.
It was adopted.
And it's worth pointing out that Sweden has long been an early leader in cultural rot. In
Yes.
1938, Sweden became the first free nation in Christendom to revert to pre-Christian abortion legislation and to institutionalize Planned Parenthood sex education and family limitation programs. So 1938,
Excellent.
Sweden, first nation in Christendom to get rid of their protections for the preborn and start allowing for the killing of children. So it's no surprise. I'm just saying that
Yes.
that's the Swedish delegates are saying, here's all the rot we're up to.
Exactly.
And that provides the blueprint for
Yes.
SIECUS.
Yes. Okay, so then it was, as we said, it was just 5 months later, SIECUS opened its doors, and there was Mary Calderon. She was eventually dubbed the Humanist of the Year for 1974. And I'm sure it was for what she did with sex education.
Yes.
And a co-recipient with her of that Humanist Award, would you be surprised, it was Joseph Fletcher, author of Situation Ethics.
Wow.
In fact, father of Situation
That's
Ethics.
right. Yes. Which, again, for those listening who might be confused by that phrase, it's just relativism.
Yes.
It's just there are no moral laws.
No.
There is no moral lawgiver.
No moral
Exactly.
absolute.
God is dead.
Yeah.
Your God is a joke.
Yeah.
If it feels
If
good,
it feels
do
good,
it.
do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, SIECUS is provided with seed money by Hugh Hefner, who, as we'll discuss later, seems to fund a lot of bad stuff.
Yes, he
Isn't that
does.
fascinating?
He does. He
Yes.
did, the late.
Yeah, and actually, I was going to bring this up later, but since we just brought him up, I believe that Hugh Hefner once told Alfred Kinsey that he wanted to be his pamphleteer.
Max Lerner said that Kinsey was the researcher and Hugh Hefner was the pamphleteer.
Yeah.
And Playboy magazine the first issue came out in 1953. And that was the year that Kinsey's Sexual Behavior in the Human Female came out.
Wow.
So again, this is the timbers being laid for this well thought out plan.
Absolutely.
And so as Kinsey was going to the to the academic elite, he is meeting with the lawmakers. Then Hefner brought Playboy to the college students, the men, who then shifted from being protectors and providers to playboys.
Yeah.
And then the women were shifted to playgirls.
Yeah, and we're gonna get to Kinsey in just one second because he deserves a full treatment. Amen.
Yes, we need.
But before we
through,
get to Kinsey, because he becomes one of the linchpins, if you will, of the entire sexual chaos revolution. We need to talk about sensitivity training. So the early SIECUS study guides seem to be the precursor to what would become the more formalized praxis or liturgy, if you will, of sensitivity training. I refer, Claire, to sensitivity training as the liturgical arm of the religion of humanism.
Thank you.
And I'm sure you'd agree.
Yes, absolutely.
But I think what very few people understand, Claire, is what sensitivity training is and how long it's been being used by the humanist revolutionaries in our schools. Can you help, especially parents and Christian leaders, understand this humanist liturgy? How do we understand sensitivity training, and how was that kind of, I guess, the application and the praxis in the schools of the kind of common presuppositional ideas that SIECUS was absorbing about the sexual rights of the child, that there's no sexual act that's taboo or wrong, situation ethics, if it feels good, do it. Christianity, it's so repressive and it's holding people back from their true human potential because there are no gods and no masters. And so, to quote Margaret Sanger, through sex, mankind may attain that great spiritual illumination which will transform the world and light up the only path to an earthly paradise, end quote. So if that's true, then why not titillate the kids? Why not sexualize them if that's the only path to an earthly paradise? So my understanding is that sensitivity training was just the liturgical application of those ideas. But can you help us understand sensitivity training?
Yeah, and that came from, and we were just talking about this, that we are not Pulitzer Prize winning journalists. We're not expert, we're not lawyers. We're moms, and a lot of the time we did our research when we were stay-at-home moms and we read the books. And so one of the organizations that I came across was RSVP America, which is Restoring Social Virtue and Purity to America. And they have a wonderful handbook that they published, and they talk about the human sexuality researchers and how they got into the academia, because then you started to get degrees in human sexuality.
Interesting.
And the first universities to offer it was New York University in 1964.
Of course.
The Institute for, I believe it was Sexual Health. It was at the University of San Francisco in 1968, and then the University of Pennsylvania in 1978. So they had developed something called the Sexual Attitude Restructuring in 1971.
Wow, yes.
And then you could get coursework in erotic massage, self-massage, sex education, course design, and implementation, sex surrogate use and therapy, fantasy, masturbation, forensic sexology. So they trained the educators. So the point was that they trained the college students who then became the educators that trained the students.
That's right.
And a lot of the coursework, Dr. Judith Riesa, when she looked back at it, if you were getting your master's or perhaps your PhD in human sexuality, you were watching a lot of porn. That's what that was. And it was the rewiring of your brain, Just like, well, I don't even watch American television anymore because I'm so disgusted with the rewiring that's going on, because now we're seeing more and more sexual deviance being incorporated into television programs. And that's sexual attitude restructuring in itself.
Yes,
so
that would be the way to describe sensitivity training.
Yes,
sexual attitude readjustment.
Yes, exactly.
And so my understanding of sensitivity training, it was essentially role playing certain situations.
Yes.
To absolve children of any ethical duties they might have in said situations.
Yes.
To borrow a phrase from Joseph Fletcher, right? That my understanding of sensitivity training is to arrange these thought experiments and role playing of conversations and sexual situations in the classroom as part of science and part of
you're
the
restructuring the students' attitudes.
Yeah,
so if
taboos.
they are in a Christian home where they're getting biblical values, they go to school and then you're reprogrammed. Your brain is reprogrammed.
Yeah, and so we are getting we're getting closer and closer to Kinsey without saying it.
Yes,
because a lot of the ideas that would drive someone to do something like that are ideas that came from, more so than anyone else, Alfred Kinsey. But you say in your book here, Claire, to quote your brilliant research project here once again, which if you can find this book used anywhere, guys, I think I spent $100 on this used on Amazon. It's hard to find. The SIECUS Circle of Humanist Revolution. You say regarding sensitivity training that there was a spring 1969 special advisory committee of the State Board of Education in California that did a thorough investigation on the subject of sensitivity training. Mm-hmm. And you quote the results of that special committee investigation from the State Board of California in 1969, so 5 years after the founding of SIECUS. And here's how you cite their conclusion. Sensitivity training is being used by those who are in fact aligned with revolutionary groups acting contrary to public policy. That is, they intend to use the schools to destroy American culture and traditions.
Yes.
A 1969 Special Advisory Committee investigation to the State Board of Education in California saying all the way back then,
yes,
oh, this is clearly a tool to destroy American culture and traditions.
Yes.
Right. That was the common denominator, kind of political motivator of a lot of these revolutionaries.
Yes.
So I think we need to go to Kinsey now if we're going to start filling in some of the puzzle pieces and gaps that our conversation has left open.
Unless you would like me to take 2 minutes, if I may.
Oh, please.
I had a personal friend who went through sensitivity training.
Okay. Tell that
with
story.
her husband. Her husband took her there because they were having marital difficulties. I unfortunately can't remember the name of the group, but it was very New Agey.
Sure.
And they went there for the weekend. And the first thing they had to do after they all became friends with whoever else was there, during the evening session, they all had to take off their clothes. And one by one, they had to stand in front of the group and discuss what they didn't like about their body, what they didn't like about their mind.
Wow.
It was brainwashing,
Yeah.
just as if you were in the Soviet Union.
Right.
It reminds me of that.
Wow.
And she was so upset that she couldn't stay there. She had to leave, and their marriage kind of went downhill too.
Yeah, shocker.
But I just thought that's where it's leading.
Yeah.
For adults at least, and probably children someday.
Yep. And all of the angry parents over the last 2.5 years that spawned this almost Tea Party level organic grassroots uprising of the mama bears and papa bears at school board meetings, which I think Attorney General Merrick Garland recognized very early to bring some of these ideas to our modern moment, could be a very damaging movement to the today's humanist and progressive revolution. And so that's why he has to come out and say, we're opening up an investigation into domestic terrorism. This was 2 years ago, of the moms and dads speaking at school board meetings. Why and what were they angry about? Yes, critical race theory, but also the pornographic sex ed in schools.
Yes.
And this goes all the way back to SIECUS.
Absolutely.
I mean, more so than any other organization that's behind the rot, the sexualizing of children,
Yes.
which, if you guys haven't really noticed, is kind of like the hot topic right now in the culture wars. And we're trying to do this to warn you, to tell you it's not going to stop,
Yes.
because it's been brewing.
Right.
It's been brewing for so long. So SIECUS constantly refers in their study guides and in their research, they constantly refer to the Kinsey reports. This becomes one of the more cited, credible sources that bolsters the allure of their intellectual and scientific credibility of what SIECUS was doing. But they also constantly refer to William Masters and Virginia Johnson, this Masters-Johnson sex ed duo team that was funded by Hugh Hefner. You actually say in your book they were funded up to the tune of $750,000 over 10 years.
Yes.
They're communicating with Kinsey. That you actually said in your book that there was a connecting link between SIECUS and the Kinsey Institute found in a referral system for information requests set up by SIECUS to share information with one another. And we've only scratched the surface. So as we now turn to that aspect of this conversation, we need to talk about Kinsey, because nobody is more significant in their demonic influence over our children, over the cultural rot in America, and over the proxy war attack against Christianity. Probably nobody more so than Alfred Kinsey. Can the two of you start arranging the puzzle pieces for us?
So Kinsey was considered the father of the sexual revolution. This was a gentleman, we were talking about going back to the law and waiting for the social science to come forward. And the American Bar Association has founded the American Law Institute because we need to get rid of the Bible-based laws and bring in this man-made law based on social science.
And would you say that that was always the goal, Audrey, of the American Law Institute?
Yes, they were founded
people don't understand how significant that organization is, how damaging they've been.
Yes. They targeted 52 Bible-based laws that once protected marriage, women, and children. And if you look at those laws today, most of them have been eliminated. So this was, as you said, there was a plan, a goal.
As early as 1962, the American Law Institute was calling for the total legalization of abortion.
Yes, exactly. So the social science came along with Alfred Kinsey in the 30s and the 40s. He was the professor at Indiana University. He taught a marriage course. His expertise was the sexual behavior of a gall wasp. He was raised Methodist, but embraced Darwin in his upbringing, his schooling. And so his idea was to study human sexuality. That if Darwin were evolved from animals and we all one and the same, then it's not a big crossover to go from a gall wasp to a human being. So,
well, yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
Wasn't that the whole premise of Darwinism?
Yes. But he had, and again, this is a stay-at-home mom who's doing the research. And at one point I said, okay, Lord, I'm not an expert in Kinsey. And that's when the Lord brought in Dr. Judith Reisman, who was the #1 expert on Kinsey. And she wrote an excellent book called Kinsey Crimes and Consequences.
Yeah. So I haven't talked you up as much as I should have yet on our conversation together this morning. You were personally mentored by Judith Reisman and are close friends with her. For those of you who don't know, because we want people listening to this who have never heard a single thing that we've been saying for the last hour. That's the whole point. So I'm not talking down to you if you're listening, but you should know who Judith Reisman is. But again, that's why you're listening to this, right? Hosea 4:6 says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." And so Judith Reisman basically built her entire life's ministry and career on debunking the science and influence of Alfred Kinsey, founder of the Reisman Institute, and published widely on all of these ideas. So guys, Audrey here is essentially picking up where Judith left off. It was mentored by Judith Reisman. So just so everyone knows how significant Reisman is, but
And she was sued by Playboy.
Yeah.
Several times.
If you have shared some interesting stories before.
Yes.
About the pain in the rear that Judith Reisman was to the modern disciples of Kinsey.
Exactly.
You can weave in some of those stories if you'd like, because I think they bolster the significance of our ministries and what we're up against. Because when these people start manifesting their inner legions and Molochs, you kind of know that you're right over the target. And so anyway, but that's up to you. But continue in terms of your research, your relationship with Reisman. I mean, very few are more grounded in how this guy got his beginnings.
Yes. And I will backtrack to say how Judith got into this was that her precious daughter, who was, I believe, I want to say either somewhere between, I think it was 10 years old, was raped by a neighbor who was 13 or 14 years old. And when she finally found this out through her daughter, the response from people would be, well, boys will be boys. This is normal for children to have sex play. And she wondered where that was. And her background was in television. She actually worked for one of my favorite children's programs that I watched growing up, Captain Kangaroo. So anyway, that's what was her catalyst to start to do the research. And she thought, where was this idea of boys will be boys, which came from Hefner, but also from Kinsey. And so she started to do the research on Alfred Kinsey and found that he, again, as I said, was portrayed as this professor at Indiana University. If you see pictures of him, he just looks like a nerd. He's got this bow tie and this tweed suit. And the media portrayed him as a happily married man with children. As a matter of fact, Hollywood had to come out with a movie to counter what those of us who are trying to bring forward about the children data. But there was a movie that came out, I think it's the Kinsey movie with Liam Neeson, and that portrays him as a researcher, pioneer, who he was the trailblazer.
I forgot about
on
that.
The sex
That's
research.
That's a bummer that Liam Neeson agreed to play that role.
Yes, she actually pleaded with him not to do that. But what really, even Kinsey's own biographers admitted that he was a homosexual sadomasochist pedophile who was very passionate about researching about sex and having no limits, as we've talked about. Yeah. So this was a quote, actually, again, just reading things, but this is an official state legislature document. This is put out by the American Legislative Exchange Council. They have a newsletter or such publication that goes out. This is called the State Factor. And Judith helped to contribute to this as well as RSVP Americas, the main catalyst behind it. The chief researcher there was Dr. Linda Jeffrey. And this is actually an official document by the largest group, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council of State Legislators. Okay. So this is official legal information, and it's titled Restoring Legal Protections for Women and Children, a Historical Analysis of the State Criminal Codes. Because RSVP America went into 35 states and found that in the sex event section, Kinsey is the sole authority on normal human sexuality.
Well, Audrey, follow the science.
I know.
Follow the science.
And even
Are you
his
a science denier?
I know.
Something tells me that word doesn't mean what they think it means.
No. And a lot of times when the sexuality education is brought in, it's always advertised as science-based, Yeah. So, but it's Kinsey's science that they're using. And his own biographer talked about Kinsey and said, this was James Jones, and he wrote a biography on Kinsey in 1997. He said, the man I came to know bore no resemblance to the canonical Kinsey. Anything but disinterested, he approached his work with missionary fervor. He wanted to undermine traditional morality, to soften the rules of restraint. Kinsey was a crypto reformer who spent every waking hour attempting to change the sexual mores and sex offender laws in the United States. In Kinsey's case, the personal was always political. So Jones also reports Kinsey concentrated on negative eugenics, calling for a program of sterilization that was at once sweeping and terrifying. The reduction of the birth rate of the lowest classes must depend upon the sterilization of perhaps a tenth of our population. So Kinsey went into the prisons. He sought out the most sexually deviant criminals because back in the 30s and the 40s, we didn't talk openly about sex. We were a modest society.
And let me pause you, Audrey, just to say that what Audrey is about to say and what she's explaining is how he justified his revolutionary religious and political goals. That just like today, you've got to add the veneer of scientific credibility to sway the people towards your agenda. Follow the science, just the professionals, right? This sort of new iteration that moved away from the common law, the biblical moral law, human history, human nature. Human nature's fixed. And so we can study human nature and we can understand man's fallenness. And we can design laws to keep men free. Right? It's been said that laws are the wise restraints that keep men free. But if you're going to displace Christianity as the dominant worldview that governs the republic, then the new kooky religions are going to take its place. But now, what's the authority that you're going to appeal to get the sheep to follow you? Science. Science. So I just wanted to pause you there to say, Audrey is now, you're going to explain to us how he goes to get his science and his data that gets canonized into so much of our culturally influential institutions and organizations, and that becomes the new morality, to quote you, Claire, with some of what some of the SIECUS founders would call their project to design a new morality. And so did he get this data, Claire, by interviewing monogamous married individuals who had never participated in an adulterous affair? I'm sure he just went to like downtown Boise, Idaho, right? I'm sure he just went to like downtown Kansas City, Missouri, right? And he just interviewed all the Christians. How does this data start building itself?
He went into the prisons. He sought out the most sexually deviant criminals.
Okay, so pedophiles. Rapists.
And pedophiles and rapists. And he interviewed them and said this is the normal sexual behavior of the American male. And this is confirmed by his own people who went back and cleaned up his data. Because originally what was so astounding about his studies was he had thousands of people in his studies. Well, they went back and looked, and actually in his adult subjects, there were 5,300. And of that, when they looked, a majority of them were aberrant males. They were not your normal, typical American. They were sexual deviants. So for the female, he interviewed prostitutes because living with someone outside of marriage was a crime in America. We had laws for that.
That's right.
And so he interviewed prostitutes. If they lived with their pimp for more than a year, he said this is a typical sexual behavior of the American married female. But probably the most disturbing is the childhood data. And it's not that we make this up. You can get Kinsey's volume. You can read it for yourself. Here is his data. And
it was obtained, correct me if I'm wrong, Audrey, by interviewing rapists and pedophiles. Am I right?
Exactly.
So talk about table 34.
34, which is the most infamous table. And we take that to state legislators and to school board meetings this says it all. This is why we have sex ed in the school. Because Kinsey claimed that infants we are all sexual from birth. So that means infants are fully capable of having sex with adults. So this table 34 documents how many orgasms do children have in a certain amount of period of time.
Timed with a stopwatch.
Timed with a stopwatch.
Between the ages of
5 months to 14 years of age. And there's a poor 4-year-old that had 26 orgasms in 24 hours. So if you wrap your head around that, that means that child was raped for 24 hours straight. And even in Kinsey's book, how does he know that a 4-year-old or a 5-month-old is having an orgasm? And his own photographer, Clarence Tripp, was on the Phil Donahue show, and he talked about it. It's on record, where he said, and Kinsey describes this in his book, that these children were crying, they were fainting, they were trembling. Clearly, trauma was being done to these children, but he interpreted it as they were enjoying the experience.
Yeah.
So he interviewed.
Sadistic and demonic.
Exactly. And he had his.
There's no other word for it but demonic. For that person to see children crying, convulsing, and screaming in pain, and to say, "Oh, they must enjoy it." You're talking about demonic stuff, obviously.
Which is part of demonic rituals, by the way. So, and again, going back to the ALEC paper, it then brings up that in 1998, when the Yorkshire investigators, Yorkshire Television did, we talked about it on your podcast, did a documentary in Kinsey. And for the first time, because in America, he has always been lionized. He has always been looked upon as this wonderful researcher that, that kind of freed us from our Victorian repression and morality to anything goes, which what we have today. And so Dr. Fritz von Bühlisek is actually a Nazi in Germany who collected data roughly and to Kinsey's sent to Kinsey from 1936 to 1956. And this is in, there are German news accounts during the trial of him that indicate that he was sending his research back to Kinsey. And what he did was that
let's slow down for a second. So this is a Nazi official.
Yes.
This is a dude who's helping run concentration camps.
Yes.
Again, well, his name was Dr. Audrey. You didn't say that. Remember,
yes,
he was just following the science.
Yes.
Right. But Dr. von Balusak or Belusak, however you say it.
Yes.
So anyways, continue. What was he doing in these concentration camps?
Well, it actually says in one newspaper, it says the Nazis knew and gave him opportunity to practice his abnormal tendencies in occupied Poland on Polish children who had to choose between him and the gas oven. After the war, the children are dead, but he lived on. Yep. That's in a national Zeitung. I'm not good on my German. In May 15th, 1957 magazine article. So clearly this was not true science. And this was not objective. This was subjective. And,
guys, let's just pause for 1 second really quick.
Yes.
Did you just hear what was said? All right. And thank you for giving the date and the name of the magazine and article that cited this. Guys, you got Nazi rapists raping children in Poland, sending data to Alfred Kinsey, one of the most lauded, celebrated figures by the American left today. So listen, when you hear people like me and Audrey and Claire in her book and Charlie Kirk and Michael Knowles and Ben Shapiro and Glenn Beck say, hey, the leftist totalitarian walk through the institutions, the humanist revolution and its precepts and goals, it's kind of like a Nazi-esque racist kind of thing.
Yes.
The goals that they implement, the dare I say, the communist deeper goals that they have.
Yes.
Of a one world government, of a totalitarian takeover, of the eugenics philosophy that animates them. Guys, it's not a Republican talking point to acknowledge the similarities between that and the Nazis, that and the occult.
Right.
And a lot of the satanic individuals that have been behind this. And guys, guess what? Targeting, murdering, and abusing children is a common denominator of the Satanists.
Yes.
Okay. So anyways.
Yeah.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
A Nazi child raper sending his data to Alfred
Yes,
Kinsey.
and he becomes the authority on normal human sexuality. And his science is used in every institution. Because if you think about it, if children are sexual from birth, and I give it an example that has been cited somewhere else, but I talked about, and Judith wrote a paper on the hepatitis B vaccine and how the field of medicine, we now look, when I was training for working in the STD HIV clinic, the whole premise, and the same was when you were trained as a sex educator, children are sexual from birth. We are told that. And so we have to help them to handle their sexuality as educators.
Right.
And then we have to treat, because if you're going to have sex outside of marriage, of course, you're going to have disease and dysfunction. So we have to be able to treat that. But most parents don't know one of the required vaccines is the hepatitis B vaccine. That's a venereal disease that is given. So Judith had brought this up, that's the evidence.
Build that out,
If a child is raped by a deviant sexual person who probably has diseases, then we've got to start vaccinating children from these diseases so that they don't get these diseases. Because if they get those diseases as children, we've got evidence that they were raped.
So Judith Reisman, your mentor,
yes,
believed that was a medical example and a medical smoking gun, if you will, that proved some of the political goals and priorities that were a result of Kinsey science and research.
Exactly.
Wow.
And then going back to the law and the Model Penal Code in 1955 of that, the fourth draft that they had, of 197 footnotes, the reference was to Kinsey on normal human sexuality.
And all of them?
On all of it, yes. On all of it. So, so now you have this idea that anything goes. I love Judith kind of summed it up. She said, according to Kinsey, all sex laws are broken, thus they must be eliminated, especially that of rape. Because non-consent is really not, consent is really fictional.
Right.
And so he said sex should be shared with everyone. He said all sex experimentation before marriage is going to increase a long-term successful marriage, and venereal disease will be reduced dramatically.
Wow.
He said children are sexual from birth. Adult child sex and incest isn't harmful to children at all. He also said that everyone's bisexual, with 37% of men being homosexual.
Wow.
So you have this set up in the law. And at the time that his first volume came out, that everyone needs to look at that awful childhood data, Table 34, was published in 1948 when we're looking at these timelines.
Right.
And so prior to that being published, there were 4 books that were published that endorsed Kinsey. And this came from Judith's book. She found this. The first one was called Sex Habits of American Men, a symposium on the Kinsey Report, edited by Albert Deutsch. And it was essays from scholars and citizens who advocated for shifting in standards related to marriage, sex, and family. And they all cited Kinsey as the authority. So now, wow, there are other people that are saying Kinsey's the authority. Then we had the Ethics of Sex Acts by a French jurist, René Gagnon, who viewed children as viable sex objects and women as parasites. Then we had About the Kinsey Reports by Dr. Donald Porter Geddes and Eric Curie, which instilled confidence in the Kinsey Reports as a collection of factual, objective data. And then the last one was wonderful, American Sexual Behavior in the Kinsey Report by ACLU founding member, attorney Morris Ernst, and historian David Loth. And Ernst advocated for the legalization of adultery, obscenity, abortion, and he was the personal representative for President Roosevelt during World War II. He was also the attorney, you'll be interested to know, for Kinsey, Sanger, the Kinsey Institute, SIECUS, and Planned Parenthood of America.
Wow.
And what he said was virtually every page of the Kinsey Report touches on some section of the legal code. A reminder that the law, like our social pattern, falls lamentably short of being based on knowledge of facts. So again, we were set up, and the country was set up that Kinsey was this authority that knew all about this. And
I want you to talk more about the American Law Institute's Model Penal Code and some of what your friend Linda Jeffrey found out about specifically some of the laws regarding the treatment of rape of children. But before you add that, Audrey, Alfred Kinsey once said something along the lines of, and I have the direct quote somewhere, the only difference between sexual enjoyment and rape is whether the girl's parents are home.
Yes.
I want you guys to think about that for a second. I mean, you can't get more evil than that.
Yes.
And listen, this was not this belief in the sexuality of children, which is the driving motivator today.
Yes.
In the targeting of our children today in 2023 in America, was not just a Kinsey thing.
Yes.
This was shared.
Yes.
By the Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States. And Claire, you here cite the SIECUS General Information Pamphlet that published in 1968, observing, quote, the need to understand oneself as a sexual human being, that all children are born and grow up as sexual beings. And then Lester Kirkendall, who you're going to talk to us about in just one second here, Claire, elaborates more on this in his SIECUS Study Guide #1. And remember, guys, the SIECUS Study Guides were kind of the precursor to sensitivity training.
Right.
And we're publishing and citing all of their friends and board members of SIECUS as just following the science. Lester Kirkendall writes in SIECUS Study Guide #1 in 1969, quote, once and for all, adults must accept as fact, there's that language of science, that young people of all ages are sexual beings with sexual needs. That's the language of pedophiles.
Yes.
And so who does Kinsey necessarily have to go interview to get his data? Pedophiles.
Yes.
So, Audrey, you just gave us a wonderful primer on the impact of those ideas in our laws. But talk more about how far that rabbit hole goes down with how those ideas and science about the sexuality of children actually had major familial and child consequences for how rape and pedophilia was treated. Can you build that out for our listeners?
Well, and when we look at the authors of the Model Penal Code, they were law professors, one from Columbia University, one Morris Plaskow, who was a New York magistrate and attorney. He stated most so-called statutory rape cases involve situations in which a male has had sexual intercourse with a consenting young female. We would have preferred to have even lowered the limit for the new age of consent, which became, that's the thing, when Kinsey's science came in and they were changing the laws, they lowered the age of consent. So it would have been adulthood. Now it was lowered to 16 or 15. And then he said, in our opinion, a girl at puberty, now think about when girls go into puberty, fully understands what she's doing when she engages in the act of sexual intercourse, and the fiction of non-consent, which the law sets up, doesn't correspond with the facts. And he was quoted as saying that in Sex Offenses in the New Penal Law, Brooklyn Law Review in 1966. Wow. So actually the Model Penal Code, when I looked it up, the history of the the American Law Institute Model Penal Code, which RSVP did a great summary of it from 1923 to 207. And in it, the Model Penal Code, they're now recommending, the American Law Institute's now recommending to lower the age of consent to 10 years old based on Kinsey.
Today.
But they're accepting that 12 can sometimes be proper age of, proper age of consent. This was in 2007. Wow. But what's interesting is, and I said this quote to you before on your one podcast, where they had all of these experts who had been trained, that were humanists, communists, that were trained in Kinsey science, who then were quoted in all of these law reviews to influence the lawmakers. And I said this quote before, the sometimes extreme seductiveness of a young female is a factor which has no place in the law, but it certainly affects motivation. Even at the age of 4 or 5, this seductiveness may be so powerful as to overwhelm the adult into committing the offense. The affair is not always the result of the adult's aggression. Often the young female is the initiator and the seducer. And that was from Ralph Silvanko and Phillips, Psychosexuality and the Criminal Law in Vanderbilt Law Review. So in 1962.
62.
So,
Wow.
but what was interesting, because I knew this because my attorney general has not signed out. Model penal. Okay, so now they have, there's a new model penal code revision that's out. And as of last year. And I just looked it up. You can Google it. But so far, 36 state attorney generals have rejected it because it is loosening penalties against the perpetrator. Because they're still pushing Kinsey's science.
Yeah.
The ultimate goal is to remove all laws. So anything goes. So if an adult wants to have sex with an infant down the road.
Guys, the slippery slope conservatives have always been right. That's what Audrey is trying to tell you. Claire was called a conspiracy theorist and a tin hat wearing weirdo in the 70s. We're being called that today.
Yes.
The conservatives were called that when they said, hey, if you encourage sexual chaos and adultery, you're eventually going to get rid of no-fault divorce laws. And the conservatives were told that they were conspiracy theorists, slippery slope.
Victorian.
Exactly. What happened? No-fault divorce laws. And then conservatives said, if you continue down this road, you're eventually going to call for the redefinition of marriage.
Yes.
And oh my gosh, we were laughed, we were mocked, we were reviled. Obergefell.
Yes.
And then conservatives were saying, actually, even before Obergefell, the true Ezekiels who were watchmen, who understand these ideas, were warning even before Obergefell that the route that the modern left is trying to take you is to pedophilia and to adult-child relationships. That as long as there's consent, then there's nothing wrong between relationships between children and adults, and maybe even incest, which actually shouldn't surprise us, given that a later executive director of the Kinsey Institute is named Wardell Pomeroy. And Wardell Pomeroy told Time magazine in a 1980 interview called Attacking the Last Taboo, he said, incest between children and adults can sometimes be beneficial. And it need not be a sign of mental illness. I was like, whoa. And he was a researcher for Kinsey. And he was a board member for SIECUS.
Yes.
And he later took on the role of executive director at the Kinsey Institute.
Can I also interject, though, Seth? Can I interject the fact that, remember what I said about Morris Plesko, that knowledge is, that he's talking about knowledge, that if a young girl has the knowledge is consent, right? In medicine, we have to, educate you on the procedure you're about to get and the risks that are involved. We give you that knowledge, and then you either consent to it or you don't. SIECUS, sex education. What are we doing? We're giving children knowledge at 5 years old on sex. And if we've given them knowledge, then that's consent. Then they can consent to this act. And that's why one of the laws that was brought in was called, because it's against the law to show obscenity to children.
Yeah.
But in 43 states, it's legal.
That's what I was going to ask you next.
If you show it in schools or in libraries. You can show porn to children, and that is legal.
Yep.
And that's why you have all these parents now who are just finding it.
Yeah.
But it's been there.
For a long time.
For a long time. But parents, I think because of COVID and being home, and parents are starting to wake up to this issue.
Yeah. Now, as we continue to frame the timbers before we turn back to you, Claire, and discuss a little bit about this guy named Lester Kirkendall, because we don't have time to discuss all of the revolutionaries that were tied up with SIECUS, but if we were to focus on one or two, he would be one of them. But before we turn to him, Claire, Audrey, I think it's important to understand how intertwined so many of the revolutionaries were.
Yes.
Sometimes even down to the family level.
Yes.
So Alan Guttmacher was the president of Planned Parenthood
Yes.
before Roe came down, so in the
Yes.
60s. But he was also the president of Planned Parenthood in 73 when we get Roe v. Wade.
Yes.
And he's the namesake of the Guttmacher Institute, which is
Yes.
Planned Parenthood's statistical research branch.
Right.
Now, Alan Guttmacher had a brother.
A twin brother.
Can you connect that piece in
Yes.
regards to the footwork or legwork being done
Yes.
with the model penal code?
Well, again.
Which, again, to remind everyone
Yes.
who's listening, the whole goal was to remove dozens of Bible-based laws
Yes.
that were specifically structured and passed to provide protections for children, family, and marriages.
Yes. Yes. And his twin brother was Manfred Guttmacher, and he was a psychiatrist, and he happened to be one of the advisors to the model penal code. So he had input
To the American Law Institute.
to the American Law Institute. Yes,
Wow.
they used him as an advisor to draft the model penal code. So you have Alan and his his brother. I mean, it's like we
connections
were
continue.
talking about the Huxleys.
Yeah.
You know, that Julius
Oh, yes. We'll talk.
Julius
We didn't talk about the
Huxley
Aldous Huxley link yet.
and Aldous.
Can you guys talk
Aldous
about
wrote,
that?
Well, Aldous wrote Brave New World
Yeah.
in 1923, and somebody said, a parent said to me, "Where do you, like where we are today, where do you see this going?" I said, "Read Brave New World."
That's right.
Because
And
that
1984.
was Brave.
The
yes,
leftists
those
actually
two.
the leftists
Yes.
actually have a decision to make
Yes.
at this moment of the culture where they have to decide whether they're going Aldous Huxley route or George Orwell.
Yes.
They have a decision to make. We're kind of
Exactly.
we're kind of at a fork in
And
the
that
road
was
right
their
now.
vision. That was their eugenic vision.
Yeah.
Were those books. And Aldous and Julius were grandfather to the father of the agnostic movement, which I am spacing his name right now. But so again, the fruit of the tree and these demonic fruits that are coming from that. So yeah, and
Julian Huxley, who we said earlier, lays much of the groundwork with G. Brock Chisholm, who you referred to, Claire, as the
he
director
was the head
World
of the
Health Organization.
UNESCO,
And
which was
yeah.
the educational arm of the UN.
Yes,
so,
he was the
yes,
he
they're
was the
all
director general of the
intertwined.
United Nations Ethical Society Cultural
Yes.
Organization, UNESCO, who sponsored
Yes.
that symposium on sex ed.
Yes.
That the Swedish delegates brought the blueprint for what Mary Calderon would build SIECUS off of.
Let-
Are you guys seeing the timbers yet?
Yes.
As we-
Well, and I want to. I'm going to end with this, and then go back to you.
I'm
But,
not in a hurry. I'm
this
being
was
educated too.
This was a Kinseyan follower who was Iris Reese, and he was the author of An End to Shame, was the name of his book.
Right, of course.
And he was, by the way, the president of SIECUS at one point. And he said, to build sexual pluralism, we must firmly root out the narrow thinking about sex that exists in our basic institution: family, political, economic, religious, and educational. We need to change our whole basic social institutional structure. We don't need a majority of the nation in order to make significant changes in our society. We need only a small percentage of the population who are dedicated to promoting all of our sexual rights.
Yep.
So a small group of people have shifted our nation.
Is all it's ever taken.
Yes.
Yeah. And
yes.
the same is
how
true on
successful
the other
they've
side
been.
of the aisle. If conservatives and godly men
People
and women
take a stand.
have the committed minority.
Yes, exactly.
Now, before we turn to this individual named Lester Kirkendall, who's kind of one of the keys, I think, or puzzle pieces to understanding the timbers of the house, help us understand the obscenity exemption laws, because this was one of the great victories of the left's long walk through the institutions. It was a way to prevent concerned citizens from even exercising their political will to stop some of the pornographic sex ed in the schools.
Yes.
What are our obscenity exemptions? Because we have obscenity laws in America still, many of them on the
Exactly.
books that aren't enforced.
Exactly. But if you're using, for example, the book you have
Which we're about to turn
yes,
to. Yeah.
Yes. If you're using porn, and there are cited examples of, now I'm hearing of teachers that are showing porn in the classroom. And they would normally be arrested if they were your next door neighbor, but because they're an educator
That's right.
and they're doing it in a school setting and they're doing it for educational purposes,
That's right.
they're allowed to do that. And so there is a small group of parents and experts who are going after these obscenity laws. And I feel
Obscenity exemption laws.
Obscenity exemption laws, yes. And I feel honored because Texas was the first state to have gone after it a few years back. Was not successful. And then
you and Monica Klein were
yes,
working
and
on
then yes, there were 4 of us. I say 4 moms that went before the committee, and we got it passed out of the committee, but it never made it to the floor for a vote. But because nobody knows that. Nobody knows that porn is legal. You know, obscenity, it is legal to show children obscenity in the classroom.
This is legalized child abuse.
Exactly.
Yes, it is.
Exactly. And think about the child who's been traumatized already by sex abuse,
Yep.
and you're putting this in front of them.
That's right.
You're also re-traumatizing them as well. So, and Indiana went after it, and so I got to be there to testify for that. And one of the former attorney generals got up, and what was funny was we sent them. We went into the parents in Indiana went into the schools, and I will tell you, Seth, there are parents all over this country that are going into their children's libraries and going into public libraries
That's right.
and having to read the most pornographic.
Yeah.
Awful
And
descriptions.
sometimes when they take it to the school board meeting and they
Yes,
read it to the
and
school
they
board,
read it.
they turn their
Yes.
mic off and they
Yes.
say that's inappropriate.
Yes.
You just proved the whole point. That's why they're reading it to say it's
well,
inappropriate.
when we were testifying before the Indiana Senate committee about this,
It's called gaslighting. by the
yes,
way.
yes, we gave them the parents of Indiana had put together a packet with excerpts from the books and from what schools all over the state. And so I read this and I'm like, whoa, this is even worse than what I thought, and gave those packets to the senators. Their aides came out before the testimony. They came out and said, okay, we read the packet. Wow, that's a lot of information. We know you guys probably won't do this, but please don't read this aloud during the proceedings because this is being televised and classrooms of children will be watching this.
Yeah.
And
You can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, Aaron Negagard, who had been the former attorney general in Indiana, he said, if you can't as adults read this, why are we giving this to children as homework? You know, so it's just ludicrous where we're at.
Because they want your children.
Yes.
May I add a little excerpt to this?
Please, Claire.
Years ago, when we went before our State Board of Education, we took Zing Sex Comics by Saul Gordon.
Oh,
it's
yes.
in there. I did not my story today, but he's in there.
the SIECUS,
and he
yes.
was such a sex pervert you can't imagine, and he admitted it. But we took them to show the state board. We were not permitted to do that.
Yeah.
They didn't even want to see it.
Yeah.
Because they already knew about him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See,
He
when
had served on a committee statewide.
yeah.
He had already, they knew who he was.
Yeah.
Well, and so, but the whole point, right, of your book here, Claire, and our conversation is that this has been brewing under the surface for a long time. We've been professionalizing pedophiles.
Yes.
That's what we've been doing.
Yes.
Normalizing.
Yes.
Yeah, and the power of normalization is something that can never be overstated. That if you do the wrong thing once, and you can fail to stand up against evil, it just gets normalized in the culture because culture is to us what water is to a fish. It's all we know.
Yes.
And so if you can normalize things in the culture for long enough, the people just become numb to it.
Yeah.
And that's actually really dangerous for a republic.
Yes.
Is that when people who would otherwise not agree with the targeting of children, the sexualizing of children, become so accustomed to that as part of their culture, that's one of the last straws of a civilization.
Well, parents are the barrier.
Yeah.
And Planned Parenthood has even said that.
Yeah.
That parents are the barrier to services for children.
Yeah.
And so I will say that as Kinsey's science has been used, and a lot of parents are like, well, I homeschool, so this doesn't affect me. Or I have older people that, oh, well, thank goodness I don't have any grandchildren, so I don't have to worry about this. Lest I remind you, this is because what happened is the family fell apart. As the sexual revolution went forward, and Kinsey said there would be long, successful marriages, we saw single parenting explode when sex ed SIECUS started up in 1964. We have the teen national statistics show teen STDs and pregnancy rate exploded, and the single parent families exploded. So now we have to have family courts to help decide who's going to get the kids, because there's all these families that are falling apart. So now we have a handbook that's called the Principles of the Family Law of the Law of Family Dissolution. And in the beginning, it says the changes, this was written in 2002, the changes in terminology cannot be expected by themselves to revolutionize how custody allegations are viewed, but they may contribute to a broader reconceptualization of the enterprise. So we're not calling families families anymore, they're enterprises, from who will possess and control children to what adjustments in family roles will be most appropriate for the child. It affirms that the options are not limited to one or two prescribed models, but rather are spread out along a continuum. And they even say parents can be relied upon to have a gender and race biases. So courts must intervene in a family on child's behalf to determine the child's best interest. And we're seeing that where schools are training children up in the trans issues, and then the schools are actually stepping in and fighting for custody of the child because they want to continue to transition them. And here's where Casey comes in. Some courts assume that the open homosexuality of a parent is detrimental to the child's interest. This treatment reflects moral judgment, not a scientific one, and even as a moral matter is subject to considerable debate. So whose science are they using? They're using Kinsey's science. Yeah. So it's not even true science that they're using. And we have the science of studying the American family for the last 70 years. Yeah. What's happened to it since we've done the sexual revolution, since SIECUS came out? Yeah.
So we quoted Lester Kirkendall earlier, who said in that SIECUS Study Guide number 1 in 1969 that children are sexual from birth. And can actually exercise sexual pleasure. Yes. Right. So this is straight out of Kinsey. This is demonic stuff. This is professionalizing pedophiles. But Lester Kirkendall, maybe Claire, appears to be one of the more significant individuals involved in the humanist experiment, part of the American Humanist Association, a board member of SIECUS, very involved. Founding member of SIECUS with Mary Calderon.
Six founders, he was one of them.
Yeah. And you quoted him making a fascinating admission. And I wanted to ask you both about this. And then I think you brought some of Lester Kirkendall's writings with us today. Yes. Which I want you to kind of build out as you address this man. But you quoted him admitting something that we all kind of know to be true, but the left will never say out loud. Kirkendall explained actually that the population agenda movement, the population reduction movement, right? Too many people on planet Earth, it actually required the sex ed movement. That you actually had to have SIECUS style sex ed if you were going to usher in a one world government to be able to deal with the scientifically proven threat of overpopulation. And here's what you cite and quote Lester Kirkendall as saying. He said, effective contraceptive methods and in the long run population control were closely linked with physiological knowledge about sex, a capacity for free discussion and attitudes towards sex roles and sex itself. Sex education, says Kirkendall, is thus clearly tied in a socially significant way to family planning and population limitation policy. And today, SIECUS's new name is SIECUS, Sex Ed for Social Change. Well, we have to ask ourselves the question, what kind of social change are they actually seeking? Let me add one more thing here, Claire. Mary Calderon, founder of SIECUS, once said, mere discussion of facts is not enough. It must be undergirded by a set of values, end quote. She's talking about sex ed. She's saying you can't just talk about facts. That conversation with children has to be undergirded by a set of values. Whose values? What social change?
Exactly.
Whose religion, right?
Yeah.
The religion of humanism, which is kind of the thesis of your entire book. So let's talk about Lester Kirkendall. Let's talk about how sex ed needs to be used to bring about population limitation.
Yes. Well, a little bit of background on him. First of all, he represented actual family life education at the founding of SIECUS because he already taught family life education in Oregon at the State University. So I believe it was called the State University. Now, Who's Who described Lester Kirkendall as a Unitarian. He listed himself as a Baptist when he was asked.
You actually made the point in your book that much of the American Humanist Association movement was actually birthed out of the Unitarians.
Yes.
Which was interesting.
Yes, it was. It was. And actually, Unitarianism, as I see it, is sort of a stepping stone to atheism. That's the way I view it.
Yeah.
You just become very open.
Well, they're universalists.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, the way he was described, it's especially confusing because in 1966, he assumed directorship of the Atheistic American Humanist Association.
Wow.
And that was 2 years after SIECUS' founding.
That's right. He became the director.
Yes. And of course, they're dedicated to the eradication of God.
That's right.
Yes.
Let's say that again. The American Humanist Association is dedicated to the eradication of God.
Absolutely.
God, or rather, God doesn't exist, and I really hate him.
Exactly.
Which is very strange.
And for now, I think it would be good for, I meant to say this earlier, that your listeners should equate humanism just with atheism.
Yeah.
It's easier for now to just picture that when we talk about humanism. Now, at the same time, he also served as editor of Sexology magazine, which has been described as very lewd and obscene.
Yes.
I used to have copies of it. I no longer do. He authored, this is good too. He authored Premarital Intercourse and Interpersonal Relations. It's a book, and it became notorious for containing case histories of 668 premarital intercourse experiences presented in living color involving 200 college-level males.
Wow.
Again, a Kinsey type thing.
Yeah.
Okay. But he's probably best known to us for having authored this book called A New Bill for Sexual Rights and Responsibilities, published in 1976. And I don't believe I'm allowed to show this.
Obscenity.
Yes, the pictures that are in here.
Let's just put you in a public high school
Yes,
classroom.
if you're in a school or a library, we can show this.
Absolutely. Maybe I'll try that sometime.
You can describe what's in this.
What's in this book? Yes. Many humanists have signed it, by the way, including seven SIECUS board of members or board of directors.
Wow.
And it either condones or endorses abortion, extramarital sex, premarital sex, homosexuality, bisexuality, pornography, sex among or with children, free sex for criminals. Kinsey had to take care of the criminals there.
Right.
And mentally handicapped. In other words, I think they have that now, don't they, for criminals? You can have sex if you want with your wife or whatever.
Conjugal visits.
But
yes.
I'm sure now it doesn't have to be a wife. And the legalization of prostitution, sadomasochism, masturbation, and the right to birth control. And last but not least, comprehensive sex education.
Yep, there it is. Signed by many of the leading humanists and revolutionaries, including people like John Money.
Yes.
John Money, for those of the people listening who don't know, is the first architect at the attempt of gender transition, gender mutilation surgeries. And so it refers to a young boy whose circumcision was botched. And so his family, with John Money, decided to just entirely castrate their newborn son,
or girl, whatever.
try to create kind of a, manufactured female parts and then raise him as a girl. Well, that man ended up killing himself, committing suicide as an adult. And when he found it out, his entire life just unraveled after that and understood why his life was always so horrible. And you even had, and I'm forgetting the name of the person who first opened up a full-blown gender transition clinic at Johns Hopkins University. I'm forgetting the name of the individual right now. But he shut it down because he was seeing that this is not helping
John Hopkins shut it down.
Anyone at all.
And
so that's John Money who's signing this, guys. And many other of some of these revolutionaries. You've got Ira Reese here, who would later lead SIECUS, who you just referred to. Paul Kurtz, who was the editor-in-chief of The Humanist. Albert Ellis, interesting, you cite him at length in your book.
The Institute for Rational Living.
Yes. Whatever.
Group.
Yeah. And Brigitta Linner, a marriage counselor and co-author of Sex and Society in Sweden.
Yes.
Who actually, I believe, reported on some of the gathering of the UNESCO-sponsored symposium on sex education and health education. And Alan Bell of the Institute for Sex Research at Indiana University, later renamed the Kinsey Institute. So there it is, guys. I doubt you'll find this anywhere. But that's who Lester Kirkendall was. And he's openly admitting that the goal is a one world government. The goal is actually population control. And so it's you say that today and you'd be labeled a conspiracy theorist, Claire and Audrey, right? And yet you've got one of the most significant individuals spawned out of the sexual revolution, Lester Kirkendall, openly admitting this. And so why is this? Because population control is best achieved if people do it willingly. The way you get them to do it willingly is to encourage radical sexual chaos and pump everyone full of birth control and puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones today. Because they'll be easier to control and they'll be limiting their own population volitionally. They'll be choosing it themselves. Because birth control assumes more liberal ideas about sex. And those more liberal ideas about sex are planted in the early minds of young people through sex ed. That's why it's linked directly to population limitation, which is one of the most common shared goals of so many of the revolutionaries that you talk about that were designing these humanist organizations.
And once again, Saul Gordon of Zing Sex Comics signed this. So that, should make you feel confident.
Very briefly, as we start winding down a little bit here, Claire, let's talk about just some of the communist links. You were talking with me off air about Joseph Fletcher, who we've already touched on as the father of situation ethics. Talk about some of his communist links, because this actually starts to become a very common denominator, doesn't it, of many of the people you talk about in this book, even if the founders and board members of SIECUS weren't actual outed communists. Almost all of them were involved and had links to communist front organizations. And so you start to wonder, okay, what is the common denominator here? Because Hitler would say things like, I don't care if you oppose me. I've got your children in my schools. right? This is like this goal of reaching children, of radicalizing them at an early age, it's sexualizing them at an early age, is a creed and common observation of communist societies. Mm-hmm. Because if you can get the kids while they're young, they'll serve you forever. And if they're educated in echo chambers where they only hear one side of things, then they'll be that much easier to control. Yes. And if you can sexualize them when they're young, and break down their moral inhibitions and systems of values that should be being inculcated by the family, then they'll be even easier to control. Because when you encourage sin and chaos, it creates docile citizens who cannot govern themselves. So anyways, all that to say, it's interesting how many communists were behind so much of the sexual revolution and the push for the radical sex ed.
If your listeners will forgive me, I can't find the quote. I have it with me, so I'm going to try to paraphrase. But Joseph Fletcher was identified, in fact, by Harry Ward, an undercover investigator for the FBI at the time. And he went on to, he actually testified, that is Herbert Philbrick, that he, as an undercover agent, joined the Communist Party and actually worked with Joseph Fletcher.
Interesting.
And Joseph
you did
Fletcher,
say that in your book.
Joseph Fletcher was a reverend and from the Union Theological Society, which has always been very leftist. So that was him. Now, we mentioned Harriet Pilpul, and I think if we get back to her, that'll be fine. But we want to finish the thought about the communist people. Remember, she worked with she was an actual authority with the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union.
So for people who missed it, you're talking about Harriet Pilpul.
Yes.
She was a lawyer, came out of the ACLU.
Yes.
And again, a pal of SIECUS, a pal of Lester Kirkendall.
Yes.
Right. I just paused you so people heard the name you said.
Okay.
And another architect, right, of this stuff.
Yes, but she, having been very high up with the ACLU, it's interesting that a former undercover operative by the name of David Gumar stated 4 years after SIECUS was founded in 1969, he said, and she was still with them, the present ACLU board consists of 68 members, 31 of whom have succeeded in amassing a total of at least 355 Communist Front citations. That's the group that she was with.
Wow.
Now, while she served SIECUS as their general counsel, she was also, you'll like this one, a member and leader of the Association for the Study of Abortion, the Association for the Voluntary Sterilization of People, and Planned Parenthood, of course. So I wanted to point that out.
And you make the point actually here in your book, Claire, that Harriet Pilpul, a SIECUS official, was also involved with the ethical movement, the American Ethical Union, which many people, I was not aware of this at all. And so let me just tell people, Claire brilliantly tracks here the early harbingers of humanism, that the American Humanist Association was not like, it's not like they came fully onto the scene out of nowhere.
Right.
There were lots of seeds that were already growing in the American soil, such that an organization like the American Humanist Association or the first Humanist Manifesto could come onto the scene at all.
Exactly.
And you trace that as these American ethical cultural societies, later birthed in the name Society for Ethical Culture or American Ethical Union,
which was
by Felix Adler. Yes.
The American Ethical Union was international.
That's right. There was a national body and an international body.
Exactly.
And so it's interesting when we start to frame these timbers once again, we start to find it impossible to believe that the individuals framing the house were not talking with one another. We find it impossible to believe that they were not functioning off of a common blueprint that was struck up before any building was begun. And so Harriet Pilpel, who with the Greenbaum, Wolf, and Ernst legal team helped draft the Articles of Incorporation for SIECUS.
Yes.
And yet, wait for this, Harriet Pilpel is also involved in the ethical movement. The American Ethical Union was a member of the American Ethical Union's Board of Ethical Lecturers Advisory Committee. And you cite a November-December 1964 issue of Ethical Culture Today reporting, quote, the Office of Greenbaum, Wolf, and Ernst provides legal counsel for the American Ethical Union, the first group of out-and-out humanist organizations before the officially recognized humanist movement and the American Humanist Association.
Exactly.
They were all talking to one another the entire time.
Here are two others that were talking to each other, if you'd like to know.
Please.
Two founders of the ACLU. One was Harry F. Ward. He was an identified communist and the first ACLU chairman. William Z. Foster, who was the former head of the Communist Party in the United States. And in 1932, and I'm going to quote him in a minute, Foster called for a cabinet-level Department of Education, which we never had before, in his book called Toward a Soviet America. And this is what he said: the schools, colleges, and universities will be coordinated and grouped under a National Department of Education and its state and local branches. The studies will be revolutionized, being cleansed of religious, patriotic, and other features of the bourgeois, which is the middle class in lingo of the communists. The features of the bourgeois ideology. The students will be taught internationalism and the general ethics of the new socialist society.
Wow.
And she joined that group and was very active.
Wow.
What year was that? That
was in 1932.
Wow.
Yes.
It's almost like they had a plan the entire time.
Yes.
Framing the timbers.
Yeah, that's right.
And also keep in mind that the almost 50%, if I didn't already say this, almost 50% of the SIECUS study guides were written by Isidore Rubin, who had been identified as a communist. And the actual record of that testimony is in the appendix of my book.
Wow. Yes, and you're for anyone who finds this book, the appendix is full of additional very helpful information
and many references.
So you cite a editorial in the Humanist from 1968 called "Is World Government Dead?" And the Humanist writes in 1968, if there is one principle upon which all humanists are united, it is the continued commitment to a world order based upon world law. That's from the Humanist magazine in 1968, saying the one common denominator shared amongst all humanists is a one world government. So much so that in 1971, many leaders of the American Humanist Association, you cite here in your book, Claire, pulled out a full-page advertisement in the New York Times on July 27, 1971, calling for, quote, a world federal government to be open at all times to all nations without right of secession, with the power to curb overpopulation. One of the signers of that advertisement in 1971 in the New York Times was Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich sat on the board of Planned Parenthood. Paul Ehrlich is the author of the very infamous book, The Population Bomb, written in 1963 or 64
that repeated the claims of Thomas Malthus from the late 1700s and early 1800s, that if the world population wasn't significantly reduced in the next few decades, you'd have massive starvation all around the world because there wouldn't be enough resources to handle the population growth. 30 years after Paul Ehrlich writes his book, The Population Bomb, the world population had doubled. Malnutrition was at an all-time low, and we were the fattest generation in American history. So once again, I don't think science means what they think it means. And yet this is how long they've been laboring at that. As we kind of wind down, guys, because we're short on time and we want to respect your time, let's, and of course, Claire, you interject at any time. Let's add this last piece. Let's talk about the occult. Because this is a significant puzzle piece, isn't it? To understanding SIECUS.
It is.
So you talk about the Temple of Understanding.
No, I'm sorry. Oh, I do
in your
in the
book.
book. Yes,
I'm
sorry.
And the meditation room at the
Yes.
UN. And you actually make the point in your book, Claire, that the Temple of Understanding was financed by many people. One of whom was
Lester Kirkendall.
Lester Kirkendall.
Yeah.
Once again, just to frame the timbers. And this is important, and then I want to defer back to you, Claire. SIECUS writes in their Articles of Incorporation on April 20th, 1964, that one of its purposes is to be religious in scope, which is funny because the humanists and the atheists always say that they're not religious, right? Mm-hmm. And on Article 3rd, paragraph G of the Articles of Incorporation of SIECUS, they say, to conduct and carry on the word of the work of the council, not for profit, but exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, literary, or educational purposes. Their Articles of Incorporation say one of the reasons is religious in scope. Well, obviously they're talking about the religion of humanism, right, which has links to the occult. Could you talk about that? Because for Christians to understand, this was a proxy war attack against Christianity and God.
Yes. First, let's understand just a quote. It's my own definition of secular humanism. It's based on all my studies. Good. It's based on reading this. It's based on reading both Humanist Manifestos 1 and 2. Yep. A conglomerate of information. So it's 2 paragraphs. May I?
Yes, of course.
I say that secular humanism is a man-centered ideology whose believers embrace in varying degrees the religion of militant atheism, the politics of socialism, the philosophy of materialism, the hypothesis, and that's all it is, it's not a theory, of evolution, and the morality of situation ethics, that is, no moral absolutes. Humanist leadership condones abortion, euthanasia, suicide, premarital sex, adultery, sexual perversions, pornography, and the use of drugs, to name a few. We've never had time to get into that.
That's right.
But humanism's major thrust aims to destroy all independent national sovereignties, to exterminate all organized religions, particularly Christianity, and to establish a one-world collectivist order in which God's word is rejected and man is his own God.
Wow.
And I wanted to be sure we understood that before we go on, and we have to discuss the United Nations meditation room.
Meditation room, that's right.
Yes.
Which Audrey has shared with me prior. You've had a chance to step into at one point.
Okay.
But the Temple of Understanding, according to you, Claire, was established in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
With the explicit goal of creating a conglomeration of the major world religions represented in these different rays of sort of a sun. And obviously what we're talking about, right, we're talking about universalism. All roads lead to God, all religions are equally true. And it's a way to usher in the one world government, because once all religions are equal and represented at the world level, then then none are. And it's just the religion of humanism.
Right.
But can you talk about kind of what you found out with the occult side of a lot of these movements and people?
I know I got it. Here it is. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. Just so you know now, we're talking about a meditation room on the first floor of the United Nations. I've been there. I've been inside, even when it was locked. I got in there that day. I was also there at a time when it wasn't locked. They used to let you go in the public. Now they don't anymore. So I want to just point back very, very briefly that the acting Secretary General of the UN's founding conference in San Francisco, June of 1945, was Alger Hiss.
Oh, wow.
And he was a secret Soviet spy who was convicted later in 1950 and sent to prison for his communist activities. After a stream of former communists testified they had worked with him in the Communist Party. And nevertheless, he was the chief planner and executive of the 1945 UN conference that drafted the charter. And Hiss carried that charter personally back to Washington.
Wow.
He was the one to hand the charter to the Congress and President.
Wow.
Now, so keeping that in mind, here we have a picture of the meditation room. When you walk into it, it's a very, very small room. I'd say, I can't measure it, but I'd say just this area that we're talking, and maybe from here over to the wall. And it's very, very dark. It's so dark you could trip. That's how dark it is. It's got a 6-ton iron ore altar in the middle of the room, and there's a single stream of light coming down on the altar. And that represents Lucifer. And I will explain how I know that. I had a magazine, a copy of the Theosophists, in 1913. I don't recall the month.
And for our listeners, Claire, too, this is fascinating because you make the point in your book that the Theosophist magazine was originally called the Lucifer magazine.
Yes, Lucifer magazine.
And that communist Annie Besant in 1891.
A Fabian socialist.
That's right, who took over the magazine and changed the name from Lucifer magazine to the Theosophist.
Yes.
And so when you're talking about this this light, you said on the altar in the UN's meditation room that you said that you can prove and know represents Lucifer.
Yes.
You say in your book that the UN's meditation room was maintained by the Lucis Trust.
Yes.
Which had been the sponsor and promoter of the Lucifer magazine.
Yes.
So, anyways.
Yes. And
it's like, whoa.
That copy in 1913 of the
Theosophist.
The Theosophist, the front cover shows Lucifer descending in a shaft of light, and he looks like an angel.
Wow.
And it says he's Lucifer.
Wow.
Okay.
On the very magazine published by the same group that was maintaining the UN's meditation room that set it
identified the
up.
statue as Lucifer.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, now moving right along. Another thing. We want to hold this up again. So as I discuss this, hopefully the camera can pick this up. So here is the 6-ton iron ore slab, but of course you can't see that shaft of light because of the photography. Okay, it didn't pick it up. But do you notice all this mural on the wall?
Yeah.
That's very interesting to me. And I can't say that I know. I can't identify everything that's in this abstract. You notice a lot of rectangles and triangles. I'll get back to that. But there's also, in occult literature, there's the all-seeing eye, they say, of God. If you look at this abstract, there's the all-seeing eye. Very modern looking, of course. And so I mean, that is definitely occult. I see that in every occult magazine, every occult, description and so forth. The all-seeing eye is there. In fact, it's on our $1 bill, is it not?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Okay. Now, you also notice here there's a staff. There's a staff, and it's engulfed or encircled by a what looks like, in abstract terms, it could be a snake. Now, this is called the caduceus. This staff with something wrapped around it. It was said to be the magic wand of the Greek god Hermes, and allegedly Hermes was most known for leading disembodied spirits into the underworld or hell, and he was able to bring some of them back, supposedly. So that's part of this.
Wow.
By the way, there's a total absence of anything in traditional religious symbolism,
right,
of course.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing is this item that's wound around it. What could that be? Now, this is called the staff, or rather the entwined item that's around that. In the occult, it's called Kundalini, and it's part of yoga. Kundalini is a Sanskrit word that means coiled, okay,
right,
or circular. In the occult, Kundalini, and I've read this in numerous places, it applies to the life force that lies like a coiled serpent at the base of the spine. We're talking yoga now, that can be sent along the spine to the head through the chanting of mantras and other sources of meditation. And this process allegedly can be unbearably painful, often accompanied by shaking, jerking, or spasms. So that's the abstract that I believe it was Dag Hammarskjöld designed that. He was I think he was a Secretary General of the UN maybe in the early days.
Wow.
So now what about these patterns here, these triangles, rectangles, and so on? I can't say what that is. I can only tell you this. If you look up Havelock Ellis in the internet,
yes,
you will find that he conducted with mescaline, the drug mescaline, he conducted a personal experiment. I think it was in 1896. And this was with mescaline. And he described that in that session, which lasted 24 hours, and keep in mind, he was an associate and lover of Margaret Sanger.
That's right.
He used to see geometrical squares and triangles. So I don't know if that has anything to do with this. I'll leave that up to somebody else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Havelock Ellis was essentially England's Alfred Kinsey.
Yes, he was.
A true sexual deviant, pervert,
yes,
and revolutionary.
And he drove his wife insane.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
By describing his experiences sexually with
Sanger.
Margaret Sanger.
Yeah. Eventually drove her insane. Yeah. What a guy! What a great husband. As we wind down, guys, because I know we need to wrap up now.
Yes.
But the last occult side of the conversation I wanted to add, Audrey, was about the apparent respect and fascination that Alfred Kinsey had for Aleister Crowley. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because for those of you who don't know, Aleister Crowley is one of the most famous Satanists of the 20th century.
Right.
Aleister Crowley has been called the Beast and the most evil man to have ever lived. He was a white supremacist and a serial rapist of children. And he summed up all the law and the prophets of Satanism when he said, "Do as thou wilt."
Yeah.
Can you talk about that last maybe occult aspect of this that people probably need to be aware of?
Yeah, and in my presentations, when I'm in the public, I show the picture, and I can hold it up. I don't know that you can see it
And
there,
what is
but
this
you can
picture?
zoom it.
Describe it for us.
It is Kinsey standing in Aleister Crowley's temple he had in Sicily. And this was a temple for Satan where he would rape, torture, and murder babies and sacrifice them to Satan.
Like literally, though.
Literally.
Yeah,
So Kinsey
not that Satan cares about whether it's figurative or literal, but we're saying for Crowley it was literal.
Yes, for literal. And the shadow of Kinsey is over Aleister Crowley. He had a tremendous amount of respect and awe for Aleister Crowley because he kept diaries of the experiences he had with these babies. And Kinsey wanted that for his data.
Yeah.
So the connection...
And he's there standing with,
Yes.
I believe, the documentarian of Aleister Crowley.
Yes, Kenneth Anger.
Appropriately named.
Yes, is with him, who is a friend of Kinsey. He's the connection between the two men. And and it was interesting because I just met somebody who was raised in this village.
Oh my gosh.
Because one of the movies I'm in, The Mind Polluters, Italy now wants that translated into Italian. They want to learn about Kinsey. And this gentleman, he said, I am from that village, and we knew of that temple.
Wow.
So he actually validated that this really does exist. And anyway, but yeah, so you have clearly the demonic occult, and my husband, being in church work in the past, has dealt with people who worship Satan. He had an encounter with one, and everything is the opposite of what Christianity is. So if we're worshiping the Lord in our service, they're raping children and hitting each other in their service.
Well, do as thou wilt.
Yes,
is just the it's just the modern translation of the serpent in Genesis 3. Ye shall be as gods.
Yes.
Eat the apple, and ye shall be as gods.
Yes.
You both have done incredible work in exposing this and connecting the pieces for American concerned citizens in the church. You lead a ministry, Audrey, called the Matthew 18 group. Why don't you leave us with a sliver of hope for the church, given the last 2 hours of heaviness that we've covered, and maybe how do we get out of this mess, and what would be your encouragement, especially to Christians?
When I started this ministry back in 1997, 20 years after Claire wrote her book, and I had those little parent meetings, I took the first Christian sex ed program, which has in it Lester Kirkendall, Alfred Kinsey, Hugh Hefner. I always say, look at the bibliography if you want to know by whose authority are these things, being written. And so this was the first Christian sex ed, and it was in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. So I was meeting with small groups of parents, and I would take the book that was intended for 10-year-olds, and it had the description of sexual intercourse. And so I would give it to a father, and I'd say, could you read this? And they couldn't. And I ended up like Claire when I started this in 1998, being put on a committee in the Lutheran school where I had grown up. And it was the Sex Education Curriculum Review Committee. And I got up to speak. And at that point, I was just starting to read her book. I'm just starting to find out about Alfred Kinsey. I had a thimble of what I know now. And I said, can I talk for 15 minutes? I asked the principal ahead of time because this is why we have a problem with this sex ed and we need to pull it. And he said, absolutely. And so I got up to speak, and it was the first time I had ever spoken on this. And I'm coughing and gagging, and I can't get the words out. And I thought, I'm going mentally through my mind while I'm doing this, thinking, okay, I'm not sick. And I'm a public speaker, so it's not nervousness. And then it dawned on me, this is spiritual warfare. So I thought, well, I'm going to sound like a fool, but I'm going to push through anyway. And I did. And when I sat down after 15 minutes, I was physically exhausted. And the thing that struck me is while I was speaking, there were male teachers there, because it was the largest committee, the most controversial. There were male teachers there. There were female teachers there. There were parents, mostly moms, the head pastor, the principal. While I was speaking, all of the men had their heads bowed. Nobody was giving me eye contact, except for the principal, who had given me permission. And I talked to Colonel Ray from RSVP America, and I shared that experience with him. And he said, that's because the Holy Spirit was speaking through you. And because, he said, our men have been compromised by the sexual revolution.
Yeah.
And our men in the church have been compromised by the sexual revolution.
That's right.
So I always, when I'm talking to audiences, I say we were born into the sexual revolution. So a lot of us carry sexual sin that has unconfessed and needs to be taken to the cross.
Right.
And because we have a loving Savior that died for those sins. But Satan loves to for us to put it in our backpack and beat us over the head so that we are ineffective in the culture we live in today. So I have prayed, Lord, just get me to the remnant, because it's not easy in this ministry to bring all of this truth, even though it's clearly the church is under attack. Christianity is under attack in America. Our biblical foundations, we're in the country of George Washington right now. And I said to her this morning, I said, we're going to battle right now in this interview, and it's spiritual warfare is what we have. So I love this quote, and it's what kind of started me in the beginning. It was Martin Luther quote coming from the Lutheran Church. If I profess with the loudest voice and the clearest exposition every portion of the truth of God, except precisely that little point which the world and the devil are at that moment attacking, I'm not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing Christ. Where the battle rages, there the loyalty of the soldier is proved. And to be steady on all the battlefield besides is mere flight and disgrace if he flinches at that one point. And we've not flinched. We've not flinched. And so I always like to, with Martin Luther King, I have a dream, and I have a dream where American colleges, Christian colleges teach this stuff. Yeah. If they went into the universities and did all this bad stuff, then let's go in and start teaching the right stuff. I have where we can restore God's law and make it honorable again. And there are legislators that actually have that intent. Judith met with Justice Scalia, and he said, instead of us coming up with all these new laws to protect what we're losing, if we threw out the common law that was based on the Bible and we brought in the model penal code, which is based on Kinsey's science, shouldn't we be throwing that out and restoring God's law and making it honorable again? Yep. I'm having a conference next month with some state legislators and pastors to look at that. Good. I mean, God is opening doors like I've never seen before. And one of them was in 2018 when I said, Lord, take me to the remnant. And just through a series of events that God set up, I ended up in Uganda at the moment that they were about to cave to the UN and Planned Parenthood International and put sex ed in their schools. And when I went in and presented this information, the Minister of Ethics and Integrity, Dr. Bachero, got up and he said, Professor Warner, never have I heard such a talk. He said, in our hearts, we knew it was wrong, but we didn't know why. Wow. And you just gave us the why. That's amazing. And I thought, wow, God put me at the right place at the right time. And it's just a matter of us taking a stand. That's what RSVP, they said, if one person takes a stand against what is going on here, and if God could take one mama and stand up against the UN and Planned Parenthood International and change one nation, what can he do with 10 people in America? That's right. So I want to encourage, we're on the winning side here.
That's right.
Yes.
And it took them a small group
That's amazing.
to get where we
Yeah.
are today.
And you helped bring about international change
Yes.
for righteousness. And
Yes.
by the way, the UN holds consultative statuses at the United Nations.
Yes.
So the goal has always been a one world government. It's always
Yes.
been to usher in a totalitarian kind of communist Marxist vision
Exactly.
at the world level.
Yes.
And Planned Parenthood does the same thing with their sex ed and abortions and birth control, and Bill Gates always trying to get poor black countries to get pumped full of birth control and abortions. And of course, Bill Gates' father sat on the board of Planned Parenthood.
Yes.
So, we're all done framing the timbers for now.
Yes.
But now that you know the why, audience, you can be one to stand.
Yes.
And be able to bring this information to the public, to your pastors, to your Christian schools where you send your kids,
Yes.
or Christian colleges, to start turning things around. And I'll give you the last thought, Audrey, but let me quote Claire one more time.
Yes.
You asked this question in your book: what type of society
You do.
can we expect to see if the foregoing values as fostered by SIECUS continue to flourish in the classroom, as young kids are encouraged to choose their own moral behavior patterns via situation ethics or relativism? This book was published in 1977. It's been almost 50 years. And could you have ever predicted American culture in 2023 when you wrote that question?
I never could have predicted that.
Yeah, look at where we are today.
Look at where we are today. Exactly.
Bad seeds, bitter harvest. And it's time for people to wake up. Audrey has a book here as well.
Yes,
and you once told Audrey, I believe, that you thought she picked up where you
She
left
did.
off. So
And
why don't you give an endorsement of Audrey's book?
I did give her an endorsement.
I mean, right now,
Yes,
to the
This
listeners.
is
But
the
you-
one you gave me. This is the one she gave
Yeah, I
me.
gifted that to her. That's
But-
how I met her. I sent her my book.
Yes,
And
but-
thanked her for her book.
Yeah.
But I told Audrey after I read this book, this definitely it should be considered as a sequel to the SIECUS Circle.
Wonderful.
And you did such a beautiful job.
10
It's
tips
very-
on how not to talk to your kids about sex.
Yes, yes.
And it has the history and the biblical principles. Because
Yes.
what do we as Christian parents do in this
Absolutely.
culture today? And I would say we can raise, I have 4 adult children. We can raise pure kids in today's culture.
Yeah.
It is possible. It is possible. So,
You've done a beautiful job.
well,
really.
I couldn't have done it without the trailblazers before me.
That's right.
So
That's
All
right.
right, you're very
I am
kind.
very grateful. I showed her a list. I have 4 people that I want to meet sometime in my life. And I had written this list a couple of years ago, and she's number 1.
Oh, that's awesome. That's amazing.
and it came to pass.
It came to
Yeah,
pass.
yeah.
And I am
Yes.
so grateful. I have, I think I've been educated.
Well, you knew this stuff before. Well, let's see. This book was published right after my dad graduated high school.
Really?
So you've known this stuff for a long time.
Yes.
You've been what Audrey and I like to call the sons or daughters of Issachar. Those who understood the times, Scripture
Yes.
says. Those who understood the times and knew what Israel ought to do.
Yeah.
With knowledge comes responsibility for what you know about and your duty to stand up against
Absolutely.
it. And so, Claire, thank you for your book.
You're
Thank
quite
you for
welcome.
being a trailblazer. And for those of you listening to this, I hope you realize the honor that you got to hear Claire talk and explain her knowledge and ideas behind this alternative humanist religion and revolution. Because if you're not aware of how what she was covering in the 70s is now manifesting fully onto the scene today, then I got nothing else for you. If you don't see that by now, I don't know if you'll ever wake up. So Claire,
That's right.
Audrey, thank you guys. Spread this, share this with your friends, send this to your pastors. My goodness, that we are returning to those early revolutionaries. We're trying to rebuild the timbers of how we got here, of this house that we find ourselves in, which seems to resemble humanism
far more than Christianity in America today. And this is not to puff you up with knowledge, to make you feel prideful. This is to inform and educate you, to mobilize you to act, to do something about this, because our children, our families are on the line. And frankly, the future witness of the church, the longer that we tolerate this.
Yes.
Any closing words, ladies?
Well, I had just started to say that I'm so grateful to be here, because I too have been educated today listening to both of you. It's been, just the way you've covered this and enabled me to cover what I can. And for Audrey to be here too. She's a great joy.
It's the first time we're meeting in person. We've talked on the phone, but we've never met in person.
I didn't even
before.
know that.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
I just feel like she's my sister.
Oh my
She
gosh,
is my
that's
sister.
incredible. Oh,
Sister in Christ.
I'm even
yes.
more happy to have been a part of it than I figured that
Yes.
you guys had hung out multiple times.
And you're responsible for bringing us together. So.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank
So
you for agreeing
kudos to you,
to
too.
come on. And our prayer, guys, if you're listening to this, is that this is something that people will be watching for many years all around the world to understand, that's
This
how
is
we
what's
got here.
happening.
And now this is what we need to do moving forward. So check out the Matthew 18 group. Audrey's been on the show before. Claire, you're a gift to the body of Christ and to the country. Thank you for your legwork so many years ago, connecting pieces that pretty much no one else had done at that time. And I'm sure that many babies have been saved, many marriages and families saved because of this book. And the work of others who read this book and were inspired to do similar
and
work.
She's a perfect example.
That's right. Amen.
And I just want to say, too, to both of you and your listeners, that I really pray that you will always live in freedom, and that always be under the guiding hand of God.
Mm-hmm.
Amen. Amen. I'll finish with my favorite. I cite him all the time, but I think you guys will appreciate this. My favorite theologian, Gandalf the Grey, the wizard in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, who said, other evils are going to come. Yet it is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those that live after may have clean earth to till.
Oh, that's beautiful.
What weather they shall have is not ours to rule. Gandalf the Grey, written by Tolkien. In other words, don't worry about the evil that's going to come down on future generations. Don't obsess over preventing prospective evils 50 years from now. Deal with the evil in the fields that you find yourself living in now, and begin uprooting that evil, so that your children and grandchildren will have clean earth to till. They'll have their own battles, they'll have their own evils, but you have a responsibility as a steward to create clean earth for future generations to plant their seeds in as well. And that's what you did with this book. So thank you both. God bless you both. If you like this episode, head on over to iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and Rumble, because I'm eventually going to get taken off of YouTube. Give us a rating and review. Subscribe. We really appreciate it. Check out this book. You can find it, of course, on Amazon or Abe Books if you can still find used copies. And, of course, Claire's book, 10 tips to how to not talk to your children about sex, and her ministry, the Matthew 18 group. If you want to hear me speak live and local or get Audrey on a stage or something like that, you can go to SethGruber.com and request me or a fellow friend that we've had on the podcast to come share these ideas with you. And if you listen to the podcast, give us 5 stars and leave us a rating. It actually helps drives up the charts and more people see the show, so more people listen to this. Thanks so much for tuning in. It's been a blessing. Share this far and wide. Until next week, I'm Seth Gruber, and this is Unaborted.